In 1997, a school bus vanished. 27 years later, the children's story left everyone in shock. The morning fog hung thick over the town of Harrington that Tuesday in April 1997, but it wasn't unusual for that time of year. What was unusual was the silence that would soon fall over the community, a silence so complete it would echo for decades to come. The sun had barely crept above the horizon when Franklin Daws pulled his beat-up Ford pickup into the school bus depot. He scratched his gray-speckled beard and checked his watch, 6:45 a.m. His shift started at 7 o'clock, and Route 67 was his favorite, just 18 kids, all between ages 7 and 9, and only 5 stops before reaching Harrington Elementary. These weren't just passengers to Franklin, they were his morning companions. Little Sarah Mitchell always sat behind him, chattering about her cat Mr. Whiskers. The Torres twins, Miguel and Maria, would argue playfully in Spanish about who got the window seat. And quiet Jimmy Chun would read his library books, occasionally sharing interesting facts about dinosaurs. By 7:15, Franklin had finished his pre-trip inspection. Bus number 67 gleamed in the emerging morning light, its yellow paint freshly washed. He climbed aboard, adjusted his rearview mirror, and fired up the engine. The familiar rumble filled the air as he pulled out of the depot, waving to dispatch operator Betty Richardson. That wave would haunt Betty for the rest of her life. Franklin's first stop was at Maple Street, where the Larson children, Emma, age 9, and her brother Jack, 7, waited with their mother. Mrs. Larson had been running late getting the kids ready, but she made it downstairs just in time to see the yellow bus round the corner. She kissed both children goodbye, watching as they climbed aboard. Emma turned and waved before disappearing into the bus. It was the last time anyone would see her. At Oak Avenue, Franklin collected the Peterson kids and the Johnson twins. At Elm Street, he picked up Jimmy Chin, the Ramirez siblings, and the Miller boy. Sarah Mitchell got on at Pine Street, already talking a mile a minute about her cat's latest adventures. The Torres twins were waiting at Cedar Street, the final stop before the school. According to everyone who saw him that morning, Franklin seemed perfectly normal. He smiled, nodded to parents, and made his usual dad jokes. When 8-year-old Tommy Miller told him a bad knock-knock joke, Franklin laughed so hard he nearly choked on his morning coffee. The school day began at 8:30 a.m. Principal Janet Whitmore noticed bus number 67 hadn't arrived, but that wasn't immediately concerning. Sometimes there were traffic delays or a flat tire. When the radio crackled at 8:45 with Betty's voice asking if the bus had arrived, Janet felt the first flutter of unease. By 9 a.m., that flutter had become a roar. The police were called. Search parties formed. Parents gathered at the school, their faces etched with worry that would soon transform into terror. The route was traced, retraced, and traced again. Franklin's friends and neighbors joined the search, certain there had to be a simple explanation. There wasn't. By nightfall, the town of 15,000 residents was paralyzed with fear. 18 children and their bus driver had vanished without a trace. No skid marks on the roads. No witnesses reporting unusual activity. No phone calls demanding ransom. Just nothing. The next morning brought the first break in the case, at least, it seemed like one at the time. Police discovered that Franklin Daws had a DUI arrest from 6 years prior, though he'd completed all requirements and maintained a clean record since. They also found something odd in his small apartment, a detailed map of the entire school district, with routes highlighted in different colors. Why would a bus driver need such a thorough map? Detective Robert Martinez asked his partner. He drove the same route every day. The pieces started falling into place, or at least they seemed to. Franklin was quiet, kept to himself. A divorced man with no children of his own, he spent most evenings alone, watching old movies and reading mystery novels. To the investigators, this painted a picture of isolation that could have festered into something darker. Maybe he wasn't the friendly driver everyone thought, Martinez suggested during one of many late-night strategy sessions. The pressure mounted. Parents demanded answers. Media trucks lined Main Street. The mayor held daily press conferences, each one more strained than the last. Someone needed to be held accountable for this nightmare, and Franklin Daws, despite maintaining his innocence, fit the role of scapegoat perfectly. 3 weeks after the disappearance, with no bodies, no evidence, and no witnesses, the district attorney announced charges against Franklin, 18 counts of kidnapping and 1 count of conspiracy. The trial was a media circus. Prosecutors used the map as evidence of premeditation, his previous DUI as evidence of poor judgment, and his solitary lifestyle as evidence of antisocial tendencies. Franklin's public defender was overworked and underpaid. The jury, composed of local residents desperate for closure, deliberated for only 4 hours. The verdict: guilty on all counts. As Franklin was led away in handcuffs, he looked directly into the courtroom camera. His voice was steady, but his eyes glistened with tears. "I didn't do this. Those children. I loved those children. Someone, somewhere, knows the truth. Please don't give up looking for them." The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Harrington tried to heal, but wounds this deep don't close easily. Annual vigils were held every April 27th, the day the children vanished. Flowers were left at each of the 5 bus stops. The parents formed a support group, then gradually drifted apart as years passed and hope faded. Bus number 67 was retired permanently. The route was renumbered. A memorial plaque was installed at the school, listing the names of the missing 18 children, and eventually, Franklin Daws as well. And still, no one knew the truth. 27 years would pass before that Tuesday morning's mysteries began to unravel, before the real horror would be unveiled, making the previous theories seem almost comforting in comparison. The notification came at 2:47 a.m. on a February morning in 2024, jolting investigative journalist Leah Monroe from her sleep. An email from a subscriber to her podcast, Wrongful Stories of Injustice, suggested she look into the 1997 Harrington school bus case. Leah rubbed her eyes, initially dismissing it, until she read the sender's postscript. "The evidence they used to convict Franklin Daws could have been planted. My sister was best friends with one of the missing kids." Leah had built her reputation examining cold cases that smelled of rushed justice, but something about this message felt different. By sunrise, she dug into public records, finding herself disturbed by the lack of physical evidence in Franklin's conviction. The case file seemed hollowed out, as if someone had carefully removed specific pieces. Her first visit to Harrington revealed a town still wearing its trauma like an old coat. The coffee shop walls displayed yellow ribbons and faded photos of children forever frozen at ages 7, 8, and 9. Franklin Daws was rarely mentioned, as if speaking his name might somehow validate the horror everyone needed to believe he'd committed. At the library, Leah uncovered something prosecutors had somehow overlooked. Franklin had called in sick the morning of the disappearance. The school's answering machine archive, stored on ancient cassette tapes, captured his gravelly voice at 5:32 a.m. "This is Franklin. My stomach's acting up something fierce. I won't be able to drive today. Did anyone verify this?" Leah asked Janet Whitmore, who still worked as principal despite being nearing retirement. "The attorneys said it was irrelevant," Janet replied, her hands trembling around her coffee mug. "They said he could have recorded it ahead of time." But Leah noticed something else in the archived dispatch logs. Betty Richardson had logged a substitute driver request for Route 67 that morning. The entry read, "J. Walker covering Daws route." "Who's J. Walker?" Leah pressed. Janet's face paled. I don't recall. We had several substitute drivers back then." The school board's 1997 records listed no J. Walker as an approved substitute. More troubling, dispatch logs showed Betty had clocked out early that same morning, something she'd never done in her 15-year career. Leah's next visit was to the state penitentiary, where Franklin Daws, now 74, moved with the careful gait of someone whose body had absorbed decades of imprisonment. His eyes, however, remained sharp. "I know what I saw that morning," Franklin insisted, his hands folded on the metal table. I remember getting up, drinking my coffee, feeling that stomach pain hit. I called the school, then went back to bed. Next thing I know, police are pounding on my door. Did you ever see the bus driver who replaced you? No, but I heard from some parents later. They said a younger fellow drove the route, someone they hadn't seen before. Tall, wearing sunglasses even though it was foggy. Leah spent weeks tracking down Route 67's families. The stories were consistent. A different driver had picked up their children. Most disturbing was Emily Larson's account. Her children had seemed hesitant to board, which was unusual. Emma had even asked, "Where's Mr. Franklin?" The substitute had reportedly smiled and said, "He's taking the day off, sweetie." Breaking from her investigation to clear her head, Leah drove to the state border for a weekend retreat. On the radio, a construction company CEO was discussing a major demolition project outside town. "We're dismantling the old Thornton warehouse district," he said. "Some of these buildings haven't been touched since the early 90s. Something clicked. The private warehouse where prosecutors claimed Franklin might have taken the bus. The one that had never been searched because the warrant was denied for insufficient probable cause. "Wait," Leah called into the radio station. "Which buildings exactly?" "The big yellow ones coming down tomorrow," the CEO replied. "Been sealed up for decades. We're actually running behind because one section has some kind of false wall we need to break through." Leah drove straight to the site. The foreman initially refused her entry until she mentioned the 1997 case. "You think this has something to do with those missing kids?" His skepticism melted into curiosity. Behind the false wall, covered in decades of dust and debris, sat a faded yellow school bus. The number wasn't visible at first, but as workers cleared away the covering, the digits emerged: 67. The bus was immediately sealed as a crime scene. DNA analysts worked around the clock. Fingerprints were lifted, fibers collected. But it was what they didn't find that proved most significant: no signs of violence, no children's belongings, no evidence of decomposition. The bus discovery triggered a media frenzy, but also something unexpected. 3 days later, a woman called the Harrington Police Department from Montreal. Her voice shook as she explained. "My son. I adopted him 15 years ago. He was around 7 when I found him. But lately, he's been having dreams, memories, maybe, of riding a bus, of other children. He matches the age and description of Matthew Reese." DNA tests confirmed it within 48 hours. The woman's adopted son was indeed Matthew Reese, one of the 18 missing children. The Montreal police station buzzed with tension as Matthew Reese sat across from investigators, his adopted mother clutching his hand. His lawyer had advised him to keep quiet, but Matthew had been carrying a burden for 5 years, ever since fragments of memories began bleeding through his carefully constructed mental barriers. "I just want to tell the truth," Matthew said, his voice catching as cameras rolled in the adjoining observation room. "They told us our parents abandoned us. That we were special, chosen for something bigger than ordinary kids could understand." Detective Amy Chin leaned forward, her notepad forgotten. "Who's they, Matthew?" "The people who took us. They called it the Nexra Project." He rubbed his temples, as if the words caused physical pain. "We weren't at some creepy compound like everyone thinks. It was corporate. There were PowerPoint presentations, employee ID badges, even casual Friday." The next 6 hours of interview footage would later shake the nation's understanding of what happened to the Harrington children. Matthew described a facility that resembled a tech campus more than a prison, complete with modern classrooms, swimming pools, and video game rooms. But beneath the surface luxury lurked something far more sinister. "They gave us new names," Matthew continued. "I was Alpha 12 for the first year. Eventually, they called me Project Matthew to make it feel more normal. There were always researchers watching us through two-way mirrors, recording everything we did. They were obsessed with how isolation affected our development." Investigators cross-referenced Matthew's memories with missing person databases. Within days, they confirmed the identities of 7 other children from the same compound, now living throughout North America. Some had been adopted through questionable private agencies. Others had been placed in foster care after being found abandoned at hospitals or shopping centers. The breakthrough came when Matthew mentioned Dr. Conrad Vellum, the name that would soon become synonymous with the case. A quick search revealed Vellum had been a rising star in cognitive development research until a plagiarism scandal ended his academic career in 1995. What authorities couldn't find in public records, they discovered through former Nexera employees who began coming forward after the bust discovery. Dr. Vellum was obsessed with creating a generation of superlearners, explained Jennifer Walsh, a former Nexera research assistant who contacted the FBI's tip line. He believed traditional childhood was worthless, that by isolating children and controlling their stimuli, he could accelerate their intellectual development by decades. The FBI raided Nexera's old headquarters in Boulder, Colorado, finding most equipment had been sold off. But in a forgotten storage unit, they discovered hard drives containing years of research data. The files painted a disturbing picture. Nexera had convinced private investors, mostly tech entrepreneurs seeking an edge, that they were funding the next revolution in human potential. The investors thought they were backing a legitimate charter school program, FBI agent Marcus Rodriguez explained during a press conference. They had no idea about the kidnapping aspect. Vellum and his inner circle did all the dirty work themselves. As media circled the story, more survivors emerged. 9-year-old Sarah Mitchell, now 36, had been living under the name Rachel in Ontario. She remembered the experiments vividly. They'd wake us at different times, test our recall abilities, limit our emotional interactions. Everything was designed to maximize what they called neuroplasticity. The Torres twins, Miguel and Maria, had never been separated. They'd escaped together in 2008 when a power outage briefly disabled the compound's security system. Too scared to reach out to authorities, convinced their parents really had abandoned them, they'd lived on the streets before being taken in by a church group in Arizona. We stayed together even when the church wanted to separate us, Maria Torres Martinez recalled. Somehow, we knew keeping our connection was our only real identity. Meanwhile, at the Oregon compound mentioned by Matthew, federal agents surrounded the building at dawn. Inside, they found not children, but adults in their mid-20s, the remaining Harrington children who had never left or managed to escape. Their conditions shocked investigators. Psychological manipulation had been so effective that several refused to believe they'd been kidnapped, insisting their education had been a privilege. Please don't remove them from their programs, begged Dr. Elena Vasquez, one of Vellum's protégés still running experiments. These subjects are on the verge of breakthrough discoveries about human consciousness. Among those found was Emily Larson, now 36, who had been conducting her own research under Nexera's guidance, completely unaware that her parents still held vigils on her birthday every year. But it was the second compound in Idaho that yielded the most crucial evidence. In Vellum's private office, hidden behind a bookshelf, investigators found detailed plans for Project Genesis, a new facility being established in Costa Rica. The documents outlined the abduction methods used in Harrington: intercepted phone calls, substituted drivers, carefully timed routes to avoid surveillance. The evidence led directly to Vellum himself, who was arrested at a luxury villa outside San Jose, along with 3 former Nexera executives. In his briefcase, police found dossiers for children in 5 different countries, preparing for what he called Phase 2 of human evolution. As the truth unraveled, the Harrington community faced a revelation far more complex than any conspiracy theory they'd ever imagined. Dr. Conrad Vellum cut an imposing figure even in custody, 6 feet tall, silver-haired, with the precise manner of someone who'd spent decades controlling variables and experiments. As investigators rifled through terabytes of Nexera's recovered data, a chilling picture emerged of a man whose brilliance had been eclipsed by dangerous delusion. The Nexera files revealed that the company had started innocuously enough, a legitimate education tech startup promising to revolutionize learning through adaptive algorithms. Venture capital poured in from Silicon Valley's biggest names, drawn to Vellum's vision of optimizing human potential from the foundational years. But somewhere between seed funding and Series A, Vellum had pivoted from developing software to experimenting on human subjects. His notebooks, seized during the raid, contained meticulous calculations. Average IQ gains of 47% when isolating subjects from familial attachments by age 7 to 9. Emotional bonds become fully plastic only when completely severed. Former Nexera employee Michael Chin, now 52, had kept silent for decades out of fear and shame. Dr. Vellum was magnetic. He testified during depositions. He convinced us we were pioneers. Every major scientific advancement required sacrifice, he'd say. Polio vaccines weren't developed without risk. The company's board of directors included several tech luminaries who claimed they'd been misled about the true nature of the experiments. Email threads contradicted some of their denials. Project Alpha shows promising results. Read one from 1998. Cognitive flexibility scores are unprecedented, though we've had setbacks with subjects 7, 11, and 14. Children who died, officially recorded as runaways, were buried in unmarked graves behind the Oregon compound. Forensic teams worked to identify the 3 bodies found there: 2 children and an Nexera staff member who'd attempted to alert authorities. The operational details of Project Harvest, the internal codename for the Harrington abduction, emerged through FBI document analysis. Nexera had spent 6 months surveilling Harrington, specifically choosing a small town with limited camera infrastructure and predictable daily patterns. They'd bribed a phone company technician to intercept Franklin Daws' sick call and report it directly to them instead of the school. Jay Walker turned out to be James Whitaker, a former actor hired specifically for the operation. His theatrical background allowed him to perfectly mimic Franklin's mannerisms while appearing just different enough to cause temporary confusion. Whitaker had died in 2003, taking most details of the morning's events to his grave. The bus hadn't taken the children to any compound initially. Instead, they were driven to a private airstrip 50 miles outside Harrington, where a modified school bus with tinted windows waited. The children, believing they were on a special field trip, were sedated during the transfer to what Nexera called their Colorado campus. Dr. Sarah Holbrook, a child psychologist brought in to evaluate the survivors, found evidence of sophisticated psychological manipulation. They used a technique called identity dissolution followed by cognitive reconstruction. Essentially, they systematically dismantled the children's sense of self before rebuilding them under new parameters. The curriculum files were particularly disturbing. Children were grouped based on intellectual malleability scores and subjected to increasingly complex problem-solving scenarios. Those who showed emotional resistance were isolated further. Rewards included contact with other children. Punishments involved what Nexera called sensory optimization chambers, essentially, sensory deprivation tanks. Emma Larson, now reunited with her parents after 27 years, struggled to articulate her experiences. I remember being so proud when I solved a puzzle faster than anyone else. Dr. Vellum would pat my head and say I was specimen quality. I didn't know I was just inmate number 4. The financial records told their own story. Nexera had received over $40 million in funding, with investors believing their money supported an advanced charter school system. In reality, roughly $2 million was spent on actual education. The rest funded the elaborate infrastructure needed to maintain the illusion and the compounds. One particularly explosive discovery was Nexera's exit strategy protocol. Children deemed unsuccessful in the program were eventually reintegrated into society through pre-planned abandonments, dropped at hospitals, shopping centers, or even private adoption agencies with falsified paperwork. Some were told their families couldn't be found. Others believed they were orphans from another country. We thought we were being merciful, testified Dr. Patricia Morrison, Nexera's former director of child services. But looking back, we were just covering our tracks. The legal implications expanded daily. Civil suits from families piled up. States that had unknowingly processed some abandoned children through their foster care systems demanded accountability. And behind it all, Dr. Vellum continued to claim his work would someday be recognized as revolutionary, the birth of Homo superior. As investigations continued, one fact became undeniable. The scope of Nexera's ambitions far exceeded the Harrington incident. Project files reference similar harvest operations being planned in 7 other communities across the United States, each targeting different demographic groups to test varied psychological conditioning methods. The revelation that corporate money could have supported such systematic child abuse sent shockwaves through the tech industry. Several venture capital firms discovered their standard partnership agreements had been exploited to fund Nexera's black budget projects without their knowledge, or so they claimed. The call to release Franklin Daws came at 7:43 a.m. on a rainy Thursday. Warden Margaret Kowalski had been expecting it, but that didn't make the moment any less surreal. "Franklin, you need to pack your things. You're going home," she said, standing outside his cell for what would be the last time. Franklin sat on his narrow bed, the morning light catching his silver hair. For 27 years, this had been his reality: steel walls, scheduled meals, and the endless echo of his own voice proclaiming innocence to anyone who would listen. Now, with trembling hands, he gathered the few possessions he'd accumulated: a Bible, reading glasses, and photographs from the vigils held each year for the missing children. "What about them?" he asked Warden Kowalski, nodding toward the photos. "Did they all make it home?" The truth was complicated. Of the 18 Harrington children, 9 had been located alive. 3 had died in Nexera's care, though the company had hidden their deaths for years. 6 remained missing, their fates unknown even after exhaustive searching. The courthouse steps were already crowded when Franklin emerged for his formal exoneration. Judge Patricia Mendoza, who had worked as a junior prosecutor during Franklin's original trial, seemed to have aged decades overnight as she read the official statement. "This court finds that Franklin Joseph Daws was wrongly convicted on all counts. We owe him not only an apology but our deepest respect for maintaining his innocence in the face of society's need for blame." Franklin's voice cracked as he spoke to the assembled media. "Those children were my world. Every morning, I looked forward to hearing about Sarah's cat, to the Torres twins arguing in Spanish, to Jimmy sharing dinosaur facts. I never stopped believing they were out there somewhere. I wish I could have found them sooner." The state settlement negotiations dragged on for months. Franklin's attorney argued for $1 million per year of wrongful imprisonment, $27 million total. The state countered with $15 million, pointing to budget constraints. They eventually settled on $22.5 million, with additional provisions for lifetime psychological counseling and healthcare. But money couldn't buy back lost time. Franklin's ex-wife had remarried and moved to Florida. His parents had died believing their son was a monster. His brother still struggled to look him in the eye, admitting, "There were nights I wished you were guilty, just so I could hate you properly instead of carrying this grief." The survivors faced their own challenges. Emily Larson returned to find her parents had aged into their 70s, her bedroom preserved exactly as she'd left it, a time capsule of childhood innocence. "They never gave up hope," she said tearfully at their reunion. "I think they needed to believe I was still out there, still their little girl." Not all reunions were joyful. The Torres twins discovered their mother had developed early-onset Alzheimer's. She kept mistaking them for the children who'd visited her dreams all these years, unable to process that her real children had finally returned. Jimmy Chen's case proved particularly heartbreaking. His parents had divorced within a year of his disappearance, unable to bear the sight of reminders everywhere. His father had committed 5 years later. When Jimmy finally returned home, he found only half a family waiting. The psychological support network established by the state employed 15 full-time therapists specifically trained in dealing with extreme trauma. Dr. Linda Patel, who led the program, noted, "These survivors experienced a unique form of captivity. They were psychologically manipulated into believing their imprisonment was privilege. Breaking through that cognitive dissonance takes incredible strength." Some survivors chose to become advocates. Matthew Reese, who'd been the first to come forward, founded Phoenix Children, an organization dedicated to identifying and supporting victims of corporate-backed child experiments. "Nexera wasn't unique," he warned during congressional testimony. There are other companies out there, maybe operating right now, that view children as resources to exploit. Sarah Mitchell channeled her experience into children's books about resilience and finding light in darkness. Her first book, The Yellow Bus That Wouldn't Forget, became a bestseller, with all proceeds going to missing children organizations. Franklin chose a quieter path. With his settlement money, he purchased a modest cabin in the mountains of Colorado, far from prying eyes. But he couldn't completely escape his past, or his newfound purpose. He began corresponding with other wrongly convicted individuals, offering advice and hope. The town of Harrington held a collective reckoning. Mayor David Morrison publicly apologized for the rush to judgment that had characterized Franklin's trial. "We wanted the monster to have a face," he admitted. "In our pain, we created one." A new monument was commissioned, this time designed by Emma Larson's daughter, a glass sculpture depicting a yellow bus transforming into a phoenix. The inscription read, "For the children of Route 67 and Franklin Daws, truth takes time, but it always arrives." Leah Monroe's podcast documenting the entire investigation became the most downloaded true crime series of 2025. Her final episode ended with recorded audio from a surprise reunion she'd orchestrated. Franklin and several survivors gathered at the old bus stop on Maple Street. In that recording, you can hear children's laughter mixing with an old man's quiet sobs of relief. Years of separation had created strangers, but grief and joy shared can forge new connections. As the sun set that day, they planted an oak sapling together, a living reminder that even the oldest wounds can nurture new growth. The Denver federal courthouse buzzed with activity as the trial of Conrad Vellum and his 3 co-defendants began in the spring of 2025. Media from around the world positioned satellite trucks along 18th Street, while inside, families of the Harrington children filled nearly every seat. Vellum, now 64, entered the courtroom with the same commanding presence he'd once used to charm venture capitalists. His defense team, one of the country's most expensive, argued that he was a misunderstood visionary whose unconventional methods had been corrupted by subordinates. But the prosecution had something more powerful than legal arguments. They had the survivors themselves. Matthew Reese took the stand first, describing the day they called him Alpha 12, when he'd scored highest on an intelligence test and received special privileges. "Dr. Vellum shook my hand and said I was proof that traditional families held children back. I was 8 years old, still wondering why my parents didn't visit." The courtroom fell silent as Emily Larson described the correction sessions. Psychological reconditioning that involved replaying fabricated memories of abandonment. "They'd wake us at 3 a.m. and make us watch videos of actors portraying our parents, saying they didn't want us anymore. After 6 months, I believed it was real." But it was Jimmy Chen's testimony that visibly shook even hardened reporters. He detailed the fate of those deemed developmental failures. "They told us Bobby Martinez was being transferred to a special program. We never saw him again. Later, I overheard staff saying he didn't adapt properly." Bobby had been 7 years old when he died from complications after being locked in a sensory deprivation chamber for 12 hours. Vellum's 3 co-defendants, Dr. Patricia Morrison, Chief Operations Officer Marcus Hellman, and Head of Security Vincent Rodriguez, each attempted to shift blame, but internal documents told a different story. Their emails revealed detailed planning of the Harrington operation, with discussions about optimal subject acquisition and maintaining plausible deniability. The prosecution called expert after expert. Dr. Rachel Weinstein, a developmental psychologist, explained how Nexera's methods constituted systematic psychological torture. They weren't just misguided educators. They implemented techniques specifically designed to break children's connection to reality and rebuild their identities from scratch. Through 4 months of testimony, the scope of Nexera's ambitions became clear. Project documents outlined plans for cognitive enhancement centers in 7 countries. They'd already established contacts in several developing nations where oversight was minimal. The Costa Rica facility, where Vellum was arrested, was intended as the flagship for their international expansion. The defense's attempt to paint Vellum as a revolutionary thinker backfired spectacularly when they presented his published theories. Just as agriculture required the domestication of wild plants, Vellum had written in 2015, the optimization of human intelligence requires the controlled cultivation of young minds freed from the chaos of emotional attachments. Franklin Daws sat quietly through most of the trial, but on the day of closing arguments, he made an unexpected appearance at the witness stand. Called as a rebuttal witness, he spoke directly to Vellum. "I spent 27 years in prison for loving those children. I worried about them every single night. And you spent that same time treating them like laboratory rats. History will remember which of us was truly guilty." The jury deliberated for only 14 hours. The verdict came on a Tuesday afternoon, guilty on all 47 counts, including kidnapping, conspiracy to commit child abuse, and obstruction of justice. As each guilty verdict was read, Vellum's stoic facade crumbled. By the end, he sat with his head in his hands, finally seeming to grasp the magnitude of his crimes. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. Judge Raymond Blackstone handed down life without parole for Vellum, plus 200 years. "You stole not just years, but entire childhoods. You didn't just separate families, you attempted to erase the very concept of family," he stated. The 3 co-defendants received sentences ranging from 30 to 60 years. The ripple effects continued long after the gavel fell. Congress passed the Child Research Accountability Act, requiring federal registration and oversight of any program involving isolated child participants. The FBI established a dedicated task force to investigate similar operations, uncovering 3 smaller programs that had modeled themselves after Nexera. Private investment firms faced civil litigation, with several settling out of court rather than expose their due diligence failures. The tech industry as a whole underwent soul-searching about the ethics of disruption at all costs. 6 months after the verdict, on a crisp October morning, Harrington held its final vigil. But this time, it was a celebration rather than a memorial. The oak tree planted by survivors and Franklin had taken root, its young leaves rustling in the autumn breeze. Franklin surprised everyone by attending. He'd spent most of his freedom in seclusion, but he felt compelled to come full circle. When families approached him with gratitude and tears, he embraced them without hesitation. "I never needed vindication," he told them. "I just needed them home." The last speaker was Leah Monroe, whose investigation had unlocked the truth. She announced that all proceeds from her book about the case would fund a new initiative, providing legal resources for other potential wrongful conviction cases. As the ceremony concluded, Sarah Mitchell approached the microphone one final time. Now 36, a successful author, and mother of 2, she held up a photograph of Franklin from 1997. The kind bus driver who'd laughed at bad jokes and remembered everyone's favorite candy. "This is how we'll remember you, Mr. Franklin. Not as a victim of injustice, but as the first good person in our lives who never gave up hope." The crowd dispersed slowly, but Franklin lingered by the memorial. He traced the names of the 18 children etched in glass, noticing for the first time that his own name had been added at the bottom. A new plaque had been installed during the night, in memory of stolen childhoods and in honor of enduring truth. As the sun set over Harrington, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, Franklin finally felt what had eluded him for nearly 3 decades: peace. The end.